Welcome to episode 32 of the Sumer Sports Show. The band is back. Myself, Eric Eager, VP of Research and Development at Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff, CEO of Sumer Sports. We were filled in for admirably by Tage Seth and Parker Fleming on Monday because we have lives and it is the off season, and I feel like giving those guys a chance to shine was important. Thomas, how was your President's Day weekend?
It was great. We were back out in Colorado a little bit and had a great time with my son Mason, snowboarding our butts off. Happy to be back. A lot on the plate. You know, that day that you come back, the first day back, we had so much going on today, as you know. And I actually just finished, and thanks for everyone, all the listeners. I mean, I was celebrating my father-in-law's 80th, so we had an extra few minutes to sing happy birthday and such. But look, I'm really excited about kicking into this offseason with you, Eric. I think there's a lot to cover, free agency and draft. This is going to be great. I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited because, we had just gotten off the phone with our friend Matt Stopsky about, the show. And I think what was really cool was I think both of us are kind of apprehensive about learning the other person's side, right? And I think that is unique. And obviously there's such a mutual I think respect and admiration there that I think will help us, carry us through, because again, like this is time of year where like I've never applied the franchise tag on a player. I've never signed a player. I've never drafted a player. And of course, like, on the analytics side, there's a ton I think you want to learn. And that kind of, I would say, for the executives and people that are watching this show, I think that's obviously somebody that an executive in the league wants to emulate, a habit of mind that I think is very, very admirable, and I think will carry the show as far as the interest level and things like that. So we will on Monday. Monday's the day before all of us go to the NFL scouting combine. We were going to talk about running backs on Monday, and then Wednesday we will have with Thomas and me at the combine. We will have some fill-ins next Wednesday while he and I are in Indianapolis. I do think we will at some point produce some video content while we are in Indy. In fact, there are plenty of people who want to talk to Thomas on Radio Row in Indianapolis, which will be pretty cool. So we thank you all for coming. As Thomas said, a little late today, but that's fine. In fact, there was a lot of people in the waiting room. I think that revved up the number of people we get on the stream right away, which is, of course, what we want. Let's talk about the franchise tag, right? Because every single year there's this question about what the franchise tag means. And, I've done a little bit of work on it. If you look at my past at Pro Football Focus, I have, an article about Dak Prescott and the franchise tag. Obviously, Kirk Cousins is a player that I've, thought was very intriguing as far as how his teams have handled his deals. And this season, Thomas, you have some marquee players who are up for free agency. Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, obviously Lamar Jackson, Orlando Brown, who was on the franchise tag a season ago for the Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. Geno Smith, looking for his first big payday in the NFL after 10 years. Josh Jacobs, the running back for the Raiders. Tony Pollard, the running back for Dallas, and a few others, of course. But those are just some names that sort of pop up. This is an instrument that you have used, I believe, 3 times in the past, right? So after your first year, you applied it to Michael Cannon, who was a punter, kickoff specialist as well. Kind of a unique guy because he did both for you guys for a while. Brent Grimes in 2012. And then for a brief time, you guys eventually got a deal done, but Grady Jarrett in 2019 was a player you applied the franchise tag to. Thomas, as an instrument, what does the general manager think of when you think of the franchise tag?
Well, let me first start by saying those were all, Eric, 3 very different applications for me as a general manager, right? One was a punter, as you said, kick specialist as well, who was, I think the number was just shy of 2.4. Think about that, everyone. $2.4 million. And I remember taking all kinds of heat in the media, right? I was reading Florio's article a while ago on it for some reason, and he was like, oh, everyone's heads are turned. They cannot believe that Dimitroff is using, a franchise tag on a kicker or on a punter. And I'm thinking, no, I mean, we approached that with that one the way we needed to, we felt. We wanted him around. We were going to try to work on something. And to me, it was a no-brainer as far as the money. You go to the next one, Brett Grimes, completely different situation in 2012. So as a GM, think about that. The punters won. Okay, not that we don't respect punters. Of course we do. But a different situation than your star corner. And that star corner situation was very different. That one was about 10-5, 10-6, I believe. So much bigger, but still a big decision to make. We had, Mike Smith and I were still together. And I want to add here on any of these, and then I will talk about Grady a little bit. To me, there are a number of instrumental players in deciding on the organization making that move. It starts with the owner, because an owner, believe it or not, can influence whether you're going to or not. They knock on your door sometimes and say, we are keeping this person, yet we're not paying this kind of money. We're going to tag him. So how, again, it's the owner's train set. As a GM, you're like, you could vehemently disagree, and you're thinking, okay, I got it. There's the head coach, of course, which makes it complicated. If you're a team builder as a GM and you have ideas and a vision, and the head coach is always more in the moment. And if you have a head coach who's on the hot seat in any way, he wants to keep someone. He knows we're not going to make these big contract moves for him. So he's pulling like crazy. Let's at least put him on a franchise tag, right? That's another one. And then, believe it or not, an agent plays into this, right? The agent and the player situation. If you have a really unruly situation, it can get really, really dicey if you start talking about using the franchise tag. It can get really harsh. And here's an interesting part for everyone to understand. It's not just that agent dealing with you in this situation. It's the agent in their own ways threatening, all right, if you screw us on this and you give this guy the tag, it's going to affect this guy, and this guy in your team, or it's going to affect the next draft pick. So you have all these factors that you think about. Interestingly enough, it's not just the money, and it's not just the player. That's life as a general manager. There's a lot. And then let me just finish. The Grady Jarrett, think about that. That was a $15+ million deal. Really, really good player. We're all really proud of what we did with him. That got complicated with Todd France. I got along with Todd France personally, but there was a lot going on there, right, to try to get that figured out. And so, but that was a big number deal. Now he's still with the Falcons, even though they were thinking about moving on from him last year. And you know where that came from? I guarantee you, Mr. Blank was knocking on Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot's door saying, we love this guy. He's Atlanta through and through. He may not fit your system, but we paid money for him as we did, and we need to keep him around here. So a lot of little factors involved.
Well, and it's so interesting because, with a guy like Jarrett, I don't know if people like me can really identify with what Grady Jarrett's going through, right? Because he's a 5th round pick out of Clemson. 5th round picks in the NFL don't make a ton of money on their first deal. Right. When you look at 15 million lump sum, I think all of us are like, holy buckets, we'd take that. Like, what the hell? But then, of course, these guys are thinking about signing bonuses. They're thinking about long-term deals. They're thinking about buying homes. They're thinking about all of this. And I think that that's like one misconception. The other one, and I want you to talk about this for a second, because this really happened last year in Kansas City, because Orlando Brown, if people remember, Orlando Brown did a pretty good job in the Super Bowl, but he's kind of a, mid-tier left tackle, right? And he wanted, left tackles are like starting pitching in baseball. Like, we all think a guy sucks, but if he gets on the open market, he's making 15 to 20 million, right? Like, that's how left tackles work. So the Chiefs, and you think about timing, right? Chiefs had to trade Tyreek Hill to get healthy into the cap to even consider Orlando Brown. And so they tag Orlando Brown just to say, look, you're playing for us this year, no matter what, right? Unless we can work out a trade, but you're playing for us. Then, right, and about these instruments, we're working on them at Sumer. It's every freaking day. It's like, okay, post June 1. If you post June 1 cut a player, right, then that spreads some of the prorated bonuses to different years, right? And you don't have to sign that player to an extension until basically July or so, right, with that franchise tag. So that the franchise tag is an instrument that also allows you to buy time. It's not necessarily used just to say, look, you're playing 1 year 20 million or 1 year 17 million. It's you're playing for us. We can't get a deal done now that works in our favor. So we're going to let a lot of stuff play out. The draft, We're going to and we're going to get more information about what our team looks like before we sign you to a long-term deal, because things could work out in such a way where you could front load his deal, right? In other cases, you could have to backload his deal. But in any event, he's playing for you, and the franchise tag buys you time as long as it doesn't get you sideways with the player.
And the sideways with the player thing, I know you, as you wildly intelligent analytics people, you turn a blind eye to that. But it's amazing. It's again, think about the small situation when you're walking into the locker room and you get the sort of mean mug look from that. That shouldn't affect you. Of course it doesn't. But then you watch it. You watch that player at times, called the way it is. They'll be in their circle with their player buddies, whether it's the locker room, and how it affects the locker room is big. Not only for that person, but hey, when your moment is up, this is what, hypothetically, the Atlanta Falcons are going to do to you. And so you have to think a lot of these things through. And again, coaching staffs are different with what they want. And so you have to play that out. Please don't underestimate the complications. It's not just a GM ramming his fist against the table saying, this is what we're doing because we're saving money.
Well, this is one thing that I want to talk about with you, because I think it's something that I kind of thought about. It was actually Les, your friend with the Rams, Les Snead, when they gave Jared Goff the long-term deal. I remember the press conference sort of being a pat on the back to Les Snead, right? In the sense of, we're the 15th pick. We move heaven and earth with the Titans to get the first pick. We draft Jared Goff. He struggles in year one. We make a change at head coach. We bring a head coach in. Jared Goff, Pro Bowls, Super Bowl. And in some ways, that contract extension is a pat on the back to the general manager who built the team using this player. And that can get complicated. But on the other side, if you're a general manager, a team builder on the other side of the paint, so to speak, and you refuse to give, let's say, Grady Jarrett a long-term deal, that defensive line coach, he wants that pat on the back, right? Because anytime I think of Andre Patterson in Minnesota, when Danielle Hunter gets an extension, that's a third-round pick I developed, and it's why are you denying me this success, this pelt on my wall type of thing. And I think that, we as analytics people kind of ignore this kind of dynamic, and it's 100% in play, isn't it?
Oh, it's 100% in play. And by the way, you keep talking about pats on the backs for GMs. This isn't crying in my soup. I didn't get that many pats on the back in that organization as much as I get along with Arthur. That just wasn't our approach. Usually the GM was the guy that was, okay, we make sure we take care of the head coach as much as possible, and the president, because he's out marketing. And by the way, all the GMs in the league will agree with me on this for the most part. You're the one is hired to take the heat one way or another. Of course, the head coach does, but you want to keep the head coach as free from it as possible during the season. During the off season, when things go down like this, it's just an interesting conversation, because it's almost like you can do no right with your decision. You can feel good that you've done the right thing, financially. But again, you have coaches, like you said, there's a coach nuance to it as well. So I don't want to.
I'm going to give you the pat on your back, because I was busy working on draft trade curves last night, and I was working on the back test of them. And there was this freaking point that would not sit on the line perfectly. And I looked at it and I said, for all my programming friends in the audience, I said, Geome text. I wanted to know who that freaking point was. And it said 2011 ATL. And I'm like, that's the damn Julio Jones trade, where all the draft curves said this is a stupid trade. And the trade actually went the other direction, of course, because Julio Jones was a Hall of Fame player, and none of the players the Browns took were any good. And so that's your pat on the back, at least from me, as much as that's worth.
Thank you.
I was working through that last night in the wee hours, which was a lot of fun. I knew it could have been that one. But I had to make sure, I had to corroborate this. Doug Analytics, who's a really cool follow, who comes to the show frequently, says, does the franchise tag set a starting floor for long-term contract players like Daniel Jones? Absolutely, right? The market, the thing that's interesting about the NFL is, and we do a lot of contract modeling at Sumer, so we bump up against this every day. The markets are artificial in that way. The franchise tag sets there are certain positions for which the market cannot get too out in front of. We talked about tight ends the last time you and I were together last Wednesday or Monday, where Travis Kelce's never going to make 25 million because the Chiefs, if he asked for that much money, the Chiefs could say, well, dude, we're just going to tag you for the tag number, which is 10 million less than that. So all gains are sort of incremental in that way, right? And so every single negotiation is tethered plus or minus a few $1,000,000 APY to that franchise tag, and that franchise tag grows basically, it's the average of the top 5 APY at the position, right? So so it grows in tandem, but their relationship with each other keeps that growth from being too big.
And we factor in, that's well explained, of course, as always. We start thinking about when we look at the tag, and quite honestly, when we do put the tag on someone, we're not sure, right? We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing, not only for the organization, but we're also, we don't ever want to look like we have egg on our face because we've signed someone to a long year contract and we're not sure the trajectory, right? We'll talk about some of these guys that are in that group that you mentioned. There are some really good football players in that upward, the two running backs, right? The way that they're moving, the way they are, that's obviously what you want. You want to make sure that you're going in where it's not been up and down. When you have an up and down career leading into that, there's no question that's a complicated decision to make. You look at your owner and you're like, the owner's asking you, are you sure you're going to spend 15, 20, 25 million APY? And you're not sure. And you take, again, that proverbial deep gulp and you're like, yes, Mr. Blank, Arthur. Yes, definitely. Julio Jones is worth 22 million, although Arthur helped with that negotiation too. We always joked around about it, meaning, he mentioned that he was going to be around for a lifetime. So obviously that was a different situation. But look, and the reality of it is there are factors that way that we're not sure about players. You put it on it. You want to get maybe 1 or 2 more years at it. What's the ruling in today's 2 years after being fired on compensation for, is it still 2 first-round draft picks?
Yes. Yeah. If you are non-exclusive tag, basically somebody can sign you away for 2 first-round picks, but that number is a lot lower. So for quarterbacks, it goes from like 45 million to 32 million. And essentially, like, I was actually talking to somebody the other day about one of the quarterbacks, and it's sort of what it does is it allows another team to negotiate with you. But we've seen this. You were still with the Patriots when this happened, but I remember in 2006, the Seahawks had Walter Jones at left tackle, they had Steve Hutchinson at left guard, and so and Walter Jones was the better, more valuable player, but Steve Hutchinson was a Hall of Fame football player, and they put like what was called at the time the transition tag, which I don't believe exists anymore, which is basically like they have the right to match any offer, which is similar to the non-exclusive except for the compensation of draft picks. And the Vikings signed him to what was called a poison pill deal, which was a 7-year, $49 million deal. And they put into it basically if at any time in the first 2 years of the deal, Steve Hutchinson wasn't the highest paid lineman on his team, the entire deal became guaranteed, which the existence of Walter Jones meant that he was gone because they were never going to guarantee the full deal. And that is what you leave yourself open to if you do the non-exclusive tag, because some team with a ton of cap space can come in and front load a deal on you and say, like, look, we're going to sign Lamar to a 4-year, 160 fully guaranteed deal with 80 million in the first year. You're screwed. That you're out of the, because you don't have 80 million in space. So you're screwed there. So there's risk associated with it. A lot of people think, oh, it's not risky. You're just letting another team negotiate with your player. But in reality, you're hanging yourself out to dry. So that's a really tough one. What about, Thomas? I want to ask, because you talk about the running backs. I really like this because I think this gets to the human element of the game. Josh Jacobs, a first-round pick, 24th overall by the lot. At the time it was Oakland, but now it's Las Vegas. Last year, he did not get his 5th-year option picked up, right? So he's a running back, and it's sort of understand it because we're talking about positional value or whatever. So he doesn't get his 5th-year option picked up, which is interesting because the Raiders drafted literally a bunch of other players, Damon Arnett, Henry Ruggs, Alex Leatherwood, all their first-round picks except Josh Jacobs stunk, to be nice about it. And Jacobs is actually pretty good, but doesn't get the 5th-year option. He comes in and leads the NFL in rushing in 2022. They name him team captain mid-season is how well he's played. And now he's in free agency. do you even dare like give him the tag? Because I feel like that is two slaps in the face to a player who has probably earned better than that, right? Like if you've been wrong on a player once and then you sort of tell him to bet on himself again, does that have locker room ramifications?
Definitely has ramifications. And I personally wouldn't do that, or I would dissuade my owner from trying to push me to do that, because that's tough, man. You're exactly right. He's proven in his own way. There are other people out there that might do that, of course, right? We know some of those people, and they may be short-lived with their, with the, the morale within their group, for sure. Meaning they're always working in sort of short term increments. At least that's how I looked at it. I mean, he has done, by the way, watching him and see what has done, of course, that was a slap in his face. I mean, I've been around guys that we haven't, given the fifth year option to. I mean, Tack McKinley was pissed, right? I mean, those are not easy, as a guy that's trying, again, back to a general manager, head coach, yes, but trying to keep everything in a good, cohesive way so that the focus is on the right things, of course. So I would not do that with him, to answer your question. I'd love to continue to talk through these guys because each one has a little bit of a different situation, as I've spoken about our three.
Well, let's talk about Daniel Jones, right? So Daniel Jones is another one where the Giants don't pick up his fifth year option because he didn't play well enough the first. And also, and this is interesting. I don't think people necessarily understand this as much, but like the top 10 picks have a different fifth year option number than I believe 11 through 32. And that changed since the original. So like the CBA is qualitatively the same, but like they did start making the fifth year option more expensive for top picks. And so Jones is a sixth overall pick. There's a little bit of an issue there as well. Like it's expensive, that's no longer cheap, but he comes in year 4 and with Brian Dable at the helm, with no wide receivers. You look at like there Isaiah Hodgson's. Like I'm a junkie, and I didn't know who that dude was. Right when Richie James was a journeyman. Kenny Galladay is a guy they gave big money to. Can't play anymore. Like they don't want him on the field. Tight ends, a bunch of young guys. They got rid of Evan Ingram, who was a first round pick, and he performs really well. Like he goes on the road in the playoffs, beats a 13-win Vikings team. It ended in Philadelphia, but we saw Philadelphia as a great team. And now he wants $45 million per year. And you're like, what are we doing here? Like, I feel like this would be the perfect example of a quarterback kind of taking $30 million a year, right? Like at $30 million a year, I think Daniel Jones and Brian Dable could provide a surplus. At $45 million, you don't give yourself much of a chance, do you?
You don't give yourself much of a chance. I'm putting myself in that scenario with Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, and I guarantee behind closed doors, they're batting their heads against the wall saying, is this really where we are going? Are we really going to pay 45? We love him. We love what he did. He stood up and did what he needed to do. He ran like he put himself on the line, right? So he did all the things as an organization you want to do. At 25 to 30 million. When you start talking $45 million, you're talking, I know we're going to talk a little bit about elasticity of quarterback contracts. My God. Now, okay, step back for a second. You have a new general manager and first year general manager going in their second year and second year head coach. They weren't responsible for drafting him, right? So there's a little bit less pressure. If this sounds odd, but if you're the guy that made the pick or the guys that made the pick and it's been up and down and you get to this spot now, you have been affected in so many other ways, right? Because you've seen the ups and downs. They've only seen this. It's a lot easier for them to go to John Mara and say, John, we are seriously thinking about, let's sign this guy. Let's get him signed, because that's all they've seen. They haven't seen that or really felt the downside of it like the other regime, of course.
Well, when you say elasticity of quarterback contracts, like I think that, this is where it gets tough, because I think of what if Daniel Jones were to hit the open market, because we do have a few examples. Now, Blake Bortles is really the only top 10 pick that ever signed for something in the middle, right? Mm-hmm. And your agent's not going to come back to you and be like, hey, I got you the Bortles contract. That's really the hard part of this entire thing, right? So I get what they're doing, but it's risky because I remember in 2019, Jameis Winston led, and I won a lot of money because I bet this and I wrote it in Peter King's column. Jameis Winston led the league in passing yards in 2019. Now, he also threw 30 interceptions, but those are just details. He threw for more than 8 yards an attempt. Jameis Winston was a more accomplished quarterback than Daniel Jones was, right? And a very talented guy. And when he went to the open market, it didn't go from top of the market to halfway. That thing went all the way to like 1.5 to 5 million. That was, I can't remember exactly what he signed for with the Saints, but he went when he didn't get over that cliff of starter money, he got all the way to backup money, right? And so if Daniel Jones wants to play musical chairs, right, and Derek Carr goes somewhere, and Aaron Rodgers goes somewhere, and Marcus Mariota goes somewhere, and Tyrod Taylor go, and they all coalesce, and this thing's not working out for him, he could lose all that. That's the game. And like when I say elasticity of quarterback contracts, it doesn't move gradually with how good you are. It's you make nothing or backup money, Chad Henne money, or you make the 45 million. And so I understand them going to the 45, but I'd like to see a quarterback of Daniel Jones's ilk lay up for 30. Right. And just understand your market, because and your guy in New England understood this the most. If you win, the money will come. And I feel like if Daniel Jones makes $45 million, they will not win. It's just mathematical to me.
I get that. Now we're going to factor this in. You guys get sick and tired of me coming back to it. When those guys are out in the market and they don't get what they think they're going to get, I mean, there is no question in my mind. You start digging into some of the other stuff, the leadership element, the true leadership. I'm not saying the midline. When you're going to pay $45 million a year for someone, you better have top notch in everything. I understand there are some limitations, but you have to be convinced that Daniel Jones is the one that's going to lead you to the promised land. I mean, as a true leader, as an intellect, which we know he's smart, but the leadership side. When you talk about Jameis Winston falling, and there is no way, if you are a very good quarterback in the league and you have questionable true leadership ability and understanding of the game or whatever it may be, and I'm not just saying him, this has happened for many quarterbacks over the years, all of a sudden your bottom drops out, because whether we like to hear it or not, there is a lot of talking about things like that, right? It comes from the organization. Unfortunately, the agents lose their mind over it, right? Because the agent has a jaded perspective of their employee, or their client, excuse me. So anyway, there are interesting, again, back to nuances of why some of these guys drop and why the other ones, will hold their value on it. But I agree with you, that elasticity, like, okay, if you don't pay him that, what's going to be what's the quarterback number this year? By the way,
45 million.
It's straight up 45. But if you're talking, I for some reason thought it was a little bit lower. You were saying 45, but if he were to sign a contract,
well, the thing that the teams do, like, so the 45 always is the APY, right? Like that's the starting point, and then essentially it depends upon where the team is cap wise, right? So Garoppolo's deal with San Fran in 2018 front loaded a lot of stuff. And, they paid it out right away. And in fact, it was genius because he got hurt early and they took their lumps. And then when they got good, he was cheaper as a function of the cap. And then there are other times where, they'll backload it. So it'll be 45 APY, but effectively, and that's part of the negotiation, right? So if you tag him, he's on the cap for 45 million. And essentially what ends up happening is you sign him to a long-term deal, and maybe that cap hit in year one is like 25, right? That's the benefit to a team, is like the team comes to the table and uses those extra years to smooth it out and give the player security while giving the team cap relief. And that's part of the negative part of the tag, is you have to have the 45 million to apply the tag in that spot. And so, that was after the Chiefs won the Super Bowl that year, that was the one year they had like $250 under the cap because they had Chris Jones on the franchise tag. They had to extend Chris Jones to open up cap space and get that number from 20, even though it was 20 APY. The first year was lower than subsequent years. And that, that's kind of, I think, when you look at Lamar Jackson, let's talk about Lamar for a second here. I mean, we talked about him a lot. This is a quarterback that you can make the argument is worth the top end deal. When you look at his gravity, how well he does, we're talking about running backs on Monday, but like, if you look at yards before contact for running backs, all the guys that play for Lamar have an easier time running the ball. The drawbacks, of course, are he's more effective when you're ahead because he's not as effective of a passer as some of these truly elite quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. And there's also the injury part. Like a lot of people say, you run the football, you get injured. He has not, finished the season the last 2 years. So there's a lot of like risk there. When we think about and we also, he doesn't have an agent, right? And this, you could talk about like what it's like to negotiate. He doesn't have an agent, right? He doesn't have an agent.
No, exactly. Right.
So like when you think about negotiating with a player who might not be able to see the daylight in a contract that benefits him and the team, that makes it really tough.
God, it's tough. No agent, look, I'm sure they're being very, very proper about how they're keeping their business inside as much as possible. But I continue, you continue to hear out there again, it may be media reports about what you're dealing with him. And you have to be clear that you want to go into battle with this guy for, like you said, another long stretch of a contract. Like you have to feel committed as a GM to look at your owner and say, 100% I'm behind this guy. And I still am not convinced. No offense, Eric, I'm not answering for you, DeCosta, but I'm just not convinced after a big contract for a linebacker. We've had that conversation. We don't need to get into it, of course, that this is who they're committed to. I mean, it's not easy for sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, it doesn't help their case with Lamar, right? Because this is a team that walked on Ngakoue. They walked on Judon after 1 year on the tag. They walked on CJ Mosley. They've walked on a lot of players. And, Eric DeCosta, they say EDC, every dollar counts, right? That's in the Ravens Twitter lexicon, right? And so you can't get like, my issue is like, you could say, oh, Eric DeCosta is stingy, right? Which isn't true. They've paid Mark Andrews. They paid Ronnie Stanley. They paid, who's the corner, Marlon Humphrey. So like they pay their stars, but he has that reputation for being stingy. But then he goes and pays $20 million APY to a linebacker who's spent half the season with the team. If you're Lamar, you're saying, okay, no more, this is everything's on the table here because they blinked on Roquan Smith. And so I think that it makes it really hard. I would not be surprised if we saw Lamar Jackson moved this offseason. A lot of people are putting him in Falcons jerseys on Twitter. That would be kind of sick, I think. Chicago might be. Every Bears fan gets so like reflexive. We saw this at the Super Bowl, reflexively angry with you if you suggest trading Justin Fields. But like you think about the Bears, how much flexibility they have. Could they maybe move Fields to Baltimore, get Lamar, and in return possibly type thing? Ravens would have to get more from the Bears in return and stuff. But I think Lamar ends up outside of Baltimore after this offseason, but that's just, I don't have any inside information there. I'm just speculating.
I feel that. Just a little aside irony. You're talking about Eric, every dollar counts. I mean, I think Eric is a very smart football man for sure. And he comes through an organization. Here's the interesting thing. That organization for coaches and GMs and personnel, man, is one of the most coveted organizations and the highest paying organizations in the league. And honestly, more, coveted in comparison to other sports. Like everyone talks about the Ravens and ownership being 100% behind their people. So I just find that a little ironic because.
Yeah, this is actually a really good question by BeatGamer99, by the way. Please like the podcast on YouTube. It helps us get more followers. It helps us build this community of great people like BeatGamer99. How would a trade even work if you're trading for him? You would have to hard time negotiating without an agent. That is a good question, but we saw this the other way, right? Roquan Smith didn't really have an agent in Chicago. And it's sort of that thing where like, obviously the grass is greener type thing. he couldn't figure something out with the Bears, but he goes to Baltimore, and it's like it's the new shiny toy, and they treat him well and all this kind of stuff. Lamar's gonna have a better chance negotiating with a team that just acquired him, because they don't have the warts, they don't have the for better or worse, they don't have the history together. And so I do think that if you trade Lamar, it's gonna be trivial to get him a contract on the second team, because trading for Lamar, much like it did with Roquan Smith, implies wanting him in a way that I don't feel like he feels wanted with the Ravens. The same way Roquan didn't feel wanted with Chicago. So I think that's the answer, but I do think that's a great question. What if we move on to?
I'm sorry, Eric. Can I say? I believe that just for everyone not to think that Lamar's just in there. He's going in to talk. I'm sure he's the one that's having the conversations, but there's no question that he has hired someone to do the minutia of his contract. He's not an agent negotiating. He's not just reading the contract himself. He might hire an attorney out there just to be the review guy. There are probably so many layers of how he's going to be dealing. There's no way he's going to be looking at that money and expecting, his cousin who's, works as an engineer somewhere to go through his contract.
Yeah.
So just so everyone knows that he's not just completely winging it.
Yeah. Yeah, but the agent having the history with the player is a real big deal, right? And the agent having kind of connections and other players who kind of like, one of the things that, it goes unnoticed, right? If you haven't been in the game, and like you obviously have for a lot longer, but in my time working at PFF with agents and knowing, the agent having a network of, like, if you screw over an agent with player A, you're also going to have to answer to that same agent with player B that you also want to sign. So there is a good faith that has to happen, and that networking, the Athletes First, CAA, like all those like big groups, Wasserman, like all those big groups, like they work together, and like there's a good faith, and the market becomes more efficient because because you have to deal with these human beings who have multiple clients. And I think it works in efficiency ways and maybe inefficiency ways, but I do think it does make the situation easier to work with when you have an agent.
Have you ever read a quote from Lamar per why he decided not to have representation?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
That's an interesting. Have you? Like,
No,
I haven't heard.
I asked that because, of course, as a general manager, I would be like in his face, like seriously, and I would be trying to cajole him into like understanding, like, what are we doing here? This is vital. We're going to be impeded through this whole negotiation for the most part. Now, I'm not talking about a guy who's the back end of the roster guy. This guy is huge in the NFL.
Well, to an anecdote to that point, my friend Brant Tillis, and I think this was in the article in SI, so I'm not giving away any inside information, but when they went to go negotiate with Mahomes, they said, look, you're going to be a Chief for as long as you play in the NFL. So that's a truth. And now let's work around that. I do think that's something that has to, and I think the Ravens are so staunch and in their in their process, they don't want to give away some of their cards there. And so maybe they didn't say that, but I do think that's an important and instructive aspect of it, to say, look, we are not letting you go. And Mahomes is better than Lamar, but Lamar is a great player, an MVP. Like, you go to him and say, look, we're not letting an MVP walk. Okay. So you're getting a deal done with us. We have these instruments. We have, the 5th-year option. We have the franchise tag. We have another franchise tag. So we have you for the next 3 years, whether you like it or not. And we're willing to pay those monies. But what we want to do is make you here 5 years. And let's get, or in the case of Mahomes, it was 10, right? And we talked about that structure on the last Wednesday's podcast, where once you get once you set those parameters, the rest of the thing just kind of you're accounting at that point. And and the Chiefs skates very intelligently, but that to me, that part has been missed in the Lamar negotiation, which is just like, you're going to be a Raven, and let's hammer out the details now. But that one's, speaking of a former Raven and a current Chief, because this one's interesting, because this will be his second franchise tag if he takes one, and that's left tackle Orlando Brown. The background on this is very interesting, because Orlando Brown was the right tackle for the Ravens. Ronnie Stanley got injured in 2020, so Orlando Brown played left tackle for about half a season. The Kansas City Chiefs were in the Super Bowl, but they were in the Super Bowl without Mitchell Schwartz, their all pro right tackle who had injured his back. He has since not played football ever again. And, Eric Fisher, their former first overall pick, tore his Achilles in the AFC title game. Mm-hmm. Patrick Mahomes is under siege. They lose, by 4 touchdowns, and they're desperate for a left tackle. So they send what was the equivalent of the 45th pick or so to the Ravens for Orlando Brown. Everybody thought that implied, and this is going to be an interesting question for you, Thomas, when you trade draft capital for a player who is on the final year of his deal, usually that implies a contract extension, right? As we just talked about. The Chiefs held their water and said, no, like we want you to play left tackle for us in 2021. And if you'll play on the tag 2022, and now we'll rethink it now that we've won a Super Bowl with Orlando Brown. What when you do trade for a player, what does that do to the negotiation? Because in the case of Orlando Brown, it's been really interesting.
I mean, the agent comes in thinking exactly what you just stated. I mean, there's a lot of leverage there, and it takes a strong organization and a strong GM and a head coach, of course, to again hold your water and hang tight on that, because it seems like the obvious that you would just, you would work this by giving up the draft capital. You'd work this into that next contract, hands down. And, again, as a GM, team builder, sorry, JT O'Sullivan, but as a team builder, I mean, you're truly, there's a lot hanging out over your head here, and that's a big decision for you, and you have to hit it right. So,
we talk about variable change, right? In a weird way. So when they took Joe Thuney for the top of the market left guard after that contract, right? So the Chiefs have historically always skimped on interior offensive linemen. They let Mitch Morse go. They let Rodney Hudson go. They let, Austin Ryder was their starting center in the Super Bowl. They let Laurent Duvernay-Tardif go be a doctor during the COVID. They skimped there. But when things broke down in the Super Bowl, they said, we're going to go get Joe Thuney, right? And they bid up for Trent Williams. They were not unable to get him. So they said, we're going to get Joe Thuney. And this is where the variable change happened. They traded their first round pick. Now they got picks back, so it wasn't exactly a first rounder. They get Orlando Brown. But after that, they take Creed Humphrey in second round, all pro center. They take Trey Smith in round 6, and he's a very good right guard. And he's on rookie money. Andrew Wiley's kind of started for them. He started for them in that Super Bowl where their offensive line was terrible. He's been okay at right tackle. So you go from not having 2 starting caliber offensive linemen pre the trade. A year later, now you have at least 3. So now Orlando Brown becomes more expendable because you held your water on his contract. And so that variable change left the Chiefs with an admirable situation. And it wasn't exactly the tag, right? It was the final year of his deal. But that shows what that franchise tag does, which is it allows for variable change, right? As time moves on, your circumstances change, and hence your orientation to the player changes. And in the case of the Chiefs, they were able to negotiate in good faith on the franchise tag on Brown, because Brown couldn't look them in the face and say, hey, without me, you're going to suck. No, without me, you're just going to have 1 fewer offensive lineman. Whereas the year before, without him, they were going to have a practice squad guy playing left tackle. So it was very interesting how they ended up working out, and good on Brett Veach, because it sounded like Orlando Brown wanted to be the highest paid tackle in football. And even though he's pretty good, he's not the best left tackle in football. And when your quarterback makes 17% of the cap, you can't make those mistakes, I think, at other positions.
By the way, these are really interesting sort of what I'm trying to say, not diatribes, but your descriptions of the Chiefs, by the way, are always really impressive. I think Brant Tillis and Brett Veach should think about, you being a very important consultant for them, because you have a really good understanding of their team, which I appreciate. You articulated it well once again. So think about this as well, you as well as the listeners. You're in the process of doing all this, and somehow you tried to get to the agent and the player in your own way, and you want nothing more than them to understand, just be realistic. Know your market. And it's not easy to do that, right? Because there's a fine line there about offending, not only, of course, offending the player, but when you're talking to the agent. Look, I've had conversations with agents before and having good relationships with them and saying, look, I don't want this to get back to player A, but the reality is he is a 6 He's good, but he is not top tier. And sometimes it's great because I can have great conversations with him. Other times that sort of circulates back to the player. Think about how deleterious that is to the negotiation and the mindset. It is again, one more of those sort of off the cuff elements, money aside, how you can function and try to convince the agent to be so much more realistic than they are. I mean, how many times people came to me throwing down all of this pomp and circumstance, delivery on what their players are. And I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. No offense to your old people, but they throw down PFF stats and they throw all this stuff out. And I'm thinking, this is unbelievable. Have you?
Well, not only that, but like when PFF was on both sides of the negotiating table, it was sort of like there was a situation where it was like, look, you're allowing agents to use your data to say stupid stuff. And like that's really the worry of it. Of course, it's like, and that's where we have to evolve, I think. And to your point, like when you work in good faith with that other side of the counter, like there's going to be situations where, if you're not familiar with an agent, like I remember, there was an agent, and I'm not going to say this person's name, who I consulted with during the pandemic, and they wanted me they were basically like, look, where would you price this player? And I was like, $8 million. And they're like, bleep you, and hung up. And I'm like, and then they call back and they're like, hey, can you give me a packet? I'm like, yeah, I'm going to give you a packet, but I'm going to price this player at $8 million. And I'm like, I don't think he's a bad guy. I don't think you're a bad guy, but like, I can't, like, I have friends like Thomas who are actually trying to win football games. Mm-hmm. And if I give a packet to you that says this player's worth 16 when he's worth 8, then I'm MFing him, right? Or her. Like, and that's not what you like. And I think that, of course, like in the rat race to try to, gain clients and, and I'm not, again, besmirching PFF in any way, but like in that rat race, you want to tell two different things to two different sides. And what are we really gaining here?
Well, I'm going to switch lanes here for a minute, but sort of broad stroke. When we were in the process of signing Matt Ryan, right? Remember, $30 million, no one had signed that contract yet. And the other thing you have to understand is within your building, you're going to be fighting that, right? My stance was always with Matt Ryan. We can pay Matt Ryan $29.25 million a year, which is big. And there were some people in our building, I won't mention their names only because I don't want them affecting their golf game when they're in Atlanta playing together. But the reality is there were people saying 29.25. I'm saying BS on that. This guy has done everything he's done for us. And if we're not willing to pay him another $700,000 a year to be the top paid quarterback, and I thought Matt Ryan was worth it. People were complaining inside and outside of our building. And the reality is within 2 months, and I'd said this to the people in the building that were, just nitpicking on it. I'm thinking, come on now. Now, if this is another person that hasn't brought you to the promised land, so to speak, I mean, we came up short, I get it, but you have to take care of your guys. When there's a guy like back to Orlando, he didn't have a ton of history there. He had no history. It's a lot easier to be, in my mind, less sort of generous, right?
So, and I think, I do think, and I don't want to come off as a Chiefs Bobo here, but like it was, one of the things that was so sad, like, and again, they're my favorite team. When I'm a fan, I like that team the most. I'm an analyst though. And like the thing that I liked about that team the most was, when we thought, like, when you think about taking a chance on trading Hill, taking a chance on not, because he could have not shown up to training camp like that. One of the things that's interesting now is players don't hold out when they're under contract because the fines are so substantial that they can't, right? They hold in now. They show up and they sit around and they chill out until they get a new deal. But players who are on the franchise tag, they can hold out because they're technically not under contract until they sign. So that is the one instrument. So when you say, okay, what leverage does the player have if you tag him? He might just not show up. And then you don't have a left tackle. And that's the really, or if you're the Giants and you tag Daniel Jones and he doesn't show up, then you don't have a quarterback, right? And you have $45 million allocated in your salary cap. So not only do you not have a QB, but you don't have the player. And so that's really tough. And when I look again at like just holding your ground on some of these things, because again, to your point, if Orlando Brown would have asked for a contract that was 18 million APY, I guarantee the Chiefs would have said, okay, but he wanted like 20, 22, 24 million APY. And it's just like, you can't do that, right? If you want to win championships, you can't pay, a defensive tackle, a left tackle, a quarterback, and a tight end top of market deals. Like, you have to know when to say when. And that, that's hard to say sometimes, but it has to be done. I think the last one I want to talk about is Saquon Barkley, because Saquon Barkley was the second overall pick in the draft. We talk about this last time we talked about tight ends. When Barkley was drafted, he became a top 5 player at his position APY because of the way running back contracts have sort of declined as a fraction of the cap. And of course, the number 2 overall pick is still a pretty good contract. It's not as good as it was when, Ryan Leaf was the second overall pick or whatever, but it's still pretty good. Wins Rookie of the Year, is a fantastic football player. Spent a lot of time on injured reserve, spent a lot of time hurt, spent a lot of time on some bad teams. This past season, he got it all back, right? He looked every bit the player that they drafted at Penn State. The running back market this year is very heavy. We talk about Jacobs, we talk about Tony Pollard, we talk about Barkley. There's a lot of things working against Saquon Barkley here. If you're the Giants, he's kind of the heart and soul of your team. And you have the Daniel Jones aspect to it as well. Like, how much does that complicate it when he really has been the guy that's run through the tackles for you through thick and thin? And, all the pressures are to not pay him. But I don't know. It just seems like a really interesting question about what they do there.
Well, it's a hard decision because we know Daniel Jones needs a proper running back, legitimate running back, and he has one in Saquon. And yet we all like to think as evaluators, GMs in our personnel department, that we can find you someone, Joe Shane. We'll go out. It may not be as good as Saquon, but we can find someone who is functional enough, who would be a more sort of sound decision. And yet, again, at the very top of it, how important, and I know the head coach and the GM know how important it is to continue to bring that quarterback along with a legit running back. And if you claim that you can find the right one, that puts a lot of pressure on your department to pull that person out. But it's a big number. Have you mentioned what is the number on the running back this year?
I believe it's 12 million, which 12 to 15, I think. When you look at running back deals, there are sort of 2 tranches right now. It's, the Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, that's 16 million. By playing the Saints all those years, like Alvin Kamara, but how much does Alvin Kamara affect the team without Drew Brees? Like, it's a really, because he's a fabulous player, but the Saints haven't been much the last 2 years after the quarterback retired. Christian McCaffrey, similarly, like when he's amazing football. He went 1,000, right? Like, it's him, Marshall Faulk, and Roger Craig, the only guys that have done that. And Roger Craig and Marshall Faulk were Super Bowl winners, and Christian McCaffrey, because the league is the way it is now, wasn't. He goes to the Niners, and all of a sudden he's in the conference title game, and that game sucked, but he made the most impressive play in that game, that run he made for the only touchdown. And running back is so context dependent. This is why, analytics folks will say running backs don't matter. It's more that running backs eat from a table that requires a full kitchen staff to make. Right, that's essentially the hard problem. So if you're the Giants, you got Evan Neal, you got Andrew Thomas, 2 great tackles, you got a scheme that is very good for your running back, and a quarterback that does a good job because he's got some running ability to him. Linebackers have to hold serve, and that helps Barkley. You don't have great wide receivers. So what happens if teams decide this year, look, we're going to dare Daniel Jones to beat us through the air? The Vikings did that in the playoff game, and Daniel Jones beat him. Right. And so Barkley had some lanes. That's where I get worried, right? Because I think Barkley is firmly as talented as Kamara and as McCaffrey. Some teams have gotten away, like the Titans and the Browns, with paying their running back more in that, and the Vikings and the Bengals more in that $12 million range. I think if you're the Giants and you could say, look, you've had the injury history, let's give you a $12 million APY deal with a lot of guarantees up front. guarantees that go above and beyond what the cap hit for the tag would be. I think Barkley would, if he's smart, like agree to that. Like if you gave him 30 million guaranteed, I think my analytics brethren would say, Eric, shut up. But I do think that would be the way to sort of bridge the gap between kind of the position being what it is, but what he represents to the Giants.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit PTSD on the running back signing. I mean, with Devontae Freeman. Look, I thought D. Freeman was a really, really good back for us. When, and you guys, we've talked about that. You remember it was midweek and he was talking about his contract in the bus. I remember just losing my mind. We've already talked about that if anyone's listened to that one before, that pod. But I remember just being stung after that with running backs because he was never the same running back after we signed him. Which, again, I know that seems simple to everyone, but it's always on your mind as a GM. Like that feeling, it's one of the worst feelings we have. How did I not see that? Or were there elements that I did see and I gambled and it didn't work, or it did work, right?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately like there are rules in, like, I think we just have to accept variance, right? Like we know that running backs, generally speaking, don't provide good return on second contracts. And there are always going to be running backs who do. Like Derrick Henry's been wonderful, right? Sure. Since, Nick Chubb is terrific as well. Kamara has had his days. Austin Eckler, like the interesting part was the running, the player that I kind of compared their player to Austin Eckler. And I was like, look, Austin Eckler's a fantastic running back. He's better than your guy. And he's going to make $7.5 million. And so like, that's where my comp is. And Austin Eckler has provided fantastic return for the Chargers on a very modest deal. Now your draft status trails with you, right? If you're the second overall pick, you're going to expect more on your second deal than an undrafted guy out of Northern Colorado. So that is a deal. But like, I think it's just accepting variance, right? It's sort of like if you have a quarterback who's not elite, don't pay him the top end deal. Now there's going to be a guy like Stafford who wins a Super Bowl, and you're just going to have to write that off and say, sometimes you get different cards than you expect. But if you take all time, we'll talk about Derek Carr at the very end, but if you pay the Derek Carrs, you pay the Ryan Tannehills, you pay the Kirk Cousins, you should expect not to win, right? Will there be a team that does it and wins? Yes. Same thing with running back. I feel like if you pay a running back a second contract, there's a good chance it's not going to work out. Now, will there be guys that work out? And are there other reasons to do so? And I think in the case of Barkley, you really have to look at your locker room and say, look, this is the guy we drafted high. He's played really well. The only thing that's gotten in his way are injuries. Do we really want to set a precedent and say, look, that's not enough to play for the Giants after your first contract? That's a hard thing to look at the other 52 guys and say.
So if you're in this situation right now, Mr. GM, and I said as a Giants about, who would you invest? I know it's simple beyond, like, of course you want to go with the quarterback, but who are you more comfortable with right now?
I would either tag Barkley or sign Barkley to a deal like Nick Chubb, like Derrick Henry, and I would let Daniel Jones go. And I think the precedent here is, and you had Dable in I believe Dable wasn't quite in Buffalo at the time, but you had Tyrod Taylor took the Bills to the playoffs in 2017 when, Brandon Beane and one of the best coaches in the NFL, Sean McDermott, were rebuilding. They traded Sammy Watkins and Ronald Darby in the same week in training camp. They were not trying to win, and they went 9-7. And Tyrod Taylor played pretty good football, like very similar to Daniel Jones. And they're so like, look, are we really going to get to the promised land with Tyrod Taylor at quarterback? No. Okay, well, we're going to draft Josh Allen and kind of take a dip for a year, and then now they are what they are. I think I would keep Barkley, and I would let Daniel Jones go.
And what would you do at the quarterback position? And where are you picking in the draft? 20 what?
I think they're in they're 25th, 26th. Yeah, something like that. I mean, Tyrod, I would probably think about a Tyrod Taylor, Jacoby Brissett, Jameis Winston type player, and just have that be the bridge.
That is such a wah moment. That's what I'm feeling. I'm putting my Joe Shane hat on. I'm like, holy shit.
But you look at Buffalo though. Buffalo they went 9 and they were picking. I can't remember where they traded, but in that draft they traded Cordy Glenn to Cincinnati, if I'm not mistaken, to move up. And they packaged those picks to go up and get Allen. Like, I think Anthony Richardson would be the guy I would draft kind of mid first round, and I'd use my picks to move up because, I just think that would be what I do. And like that would be how you would get the fan base riled up. Now I understand the fan base being angry with that because it's like, you just drafted the guy 6th overall and he sucked for 3 years and then was good. And now you're telling us to get back on this train again. Bleep you. Like, I get it. But I also have seen, like, look, the NFL, the train tracks of the NFL are filled with corpses of the Vikings with Cousins, the Raiders with Carr, I mean, even the Colts with Matt Ryan, the Colts with Carson Wentz, all the mid-tier quarterbacks don't get you to the promised land. They just they get you in a comfortable place, but that's more want to me is like going 7-10 and 8-9 and like for an extended period of time. And I know for a franchise that's been bad for a few years in a row, I get where you'd rather be in competitive games in January than not. But those fan bases, as you know, they're never going to be satisfied with mediocre. Once you get to mediocre, they're going to be like, well, why aren't we winning Super Bowls? So
my thought on that, it's interesting you say that because I keep putting myself in that spot and I'm thinking, all right, we're not really sure that he's middling, right? I mean, you're not. We're thinking that, okay, could he be good? I'm always a believer. Could he be a top 12 quarterback? We don't know that. Where is he? 15? Is he midline?
But like Kirk Cousins is a top 10 quarterback, and
what's surprising to me, exactly, which I don't
like. Well, because one of the things that's interesting is like the league has lost. So in a weird way, and I had a friend, Justice Mosqueda, talk to me about this, and he's very intelligent. I took, and when we were talking about the Dak contract, he's like, Eric, when Drew Brees and all these guys retire, Dak is going to be like a top 6 quarterback in the NFL. Like, you forget this. And I think he's right, but he's wrong because with all of these great quarterbacks retiring, the rookie contract actually means more because if you have a great defense, you can kick the hell out of these teams that have Daks and have Cousins. And like when the league was full of great quarterbacks, you couldn't win with defense. And so, you had to have the elite guy you guys had with Matt, like you had to have the elite guy to compete. But now that there's only like 4 or 5 elite guys and they're all in one conference, you can make the Super Bowl having a wagon of a defense like the Eagles and having a guy like Cousins and having a guy like, Carr, and like that prevents you from having a fighting chance on that side of the ball. And that's kind of where I get a little nervous about, paying a mid-tier guy, I guess.
So Joe, Shane, and Brian Daboll, of course, Daboll was coach of the year, right? Did some really, really good things. And they were coming in last year with not a whole bunch of pressure on them, right? Mm-mm. The world was theirs. This is the start of some really, really tough decisions for them over the years. And this, quite honestly, is where Joe Shane truly starts to get judged. I'm a huge believer in GMs are judged by their big moves. I know I've probably said that before. Yeah, people like to say, oh, that 5th rounder worked or the free agent worked. That's great. There's no pressure in those moves at all. Mm-hmm. I'm talking the big moves. This is a big move. It wasn't. He didn't draft him, of course, nor did Brian. But here they are in a really interesting crossroads spot. You're making the GM move. You move on from that quarterback. I have to say that I'd stay with the quarterback and ride the idea that we're going to get what we can get out of him. He's growing. He's maturing. I'm going to stay there. It's going to be expensive for us. I'm more apt to think, hey, running back, Saquon, look, I love what you did, but there's some other guys out there. That's probably the difference between us, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think the only thing that I would caution against, and this is something we have learned over the past few years, is you want to make that contract. You want to make that contract long then. Like if you commit to Daniel Jones, commit to him for 5 years. And, and they have, I think something like 40, I can't remember, it was like 40, I can't remember his effective cap space or whatever, but like they have enough money to front load Daniel Jones's contract and then, maybe take their lumps this year because the rest of the roster isn't complete. But then, as a fraction of the cap, like the tricky part of the quarterback deals too, is that they grow at anywhere from 12 to 15%, 10 to 15% a year, while the cap grows at about 8% a year. So every dollar you pound into one of those like elite quarterback deals, you get like the cap grows, but not as fast as those deals grow. So what you need to do, and this is where the Vikings erred with signing Cousins, because Cousins was on those 3-year deals, and you're like, oh, if he stinks, and we talked about this with Jack in a text today, the risk is two ways. The one risk is if he stinks, right? Obviously, then you just wasted those years. The other risk is if he's just good enough to earn a second contract, because he's going to turn around not in 3 years, in 2 years, and go for that top of the market deal again, and then you're right back to the issue. So if you go with Daniel Jones, it's ironic to say this because I'm the guy saying don't sign him at all. But if you sign him, you want to sign him to a 5-year deal so that by the end of the deal, he's making decent, like low money relative to the cap growth. And then you can probably win. And that's what happened in Vegas with Derek Carr. And that's what's never been able to happen with like a guy like Cousins. And it happened with Jimmy G in San Francisco. By the time Jimmy G's contract was in the final years, he was fine. Like his money was okay. It's just it's the early years where it really gets you. And that's if you can front load the deal. And that's my amended suggestion.
That's great. And the grounding factor back to the personality and the character and the leadership. And can he truly win, when it's all hanging out? I mean, I don't know if you have that judgment of him as a football fan right now. You better believe his head coach and his GM have a really good feel if they're going to make that decision, right? Because that is probably my caveat. If there's any indication like, man, we were holding on to our ass the whole season, God bless him, he pulled us through. Of course, you're not signing him.
Yeah, and I do think Jones has some toughness to him. I do think he's got, he's been hurt before. This was the 1 year he stayed healthy. But he runs tough. I think he takes hits in the pocket really tough. I think he will throw into coverage. He showed this year that he could play with sub-caliber wide receivers. I do think that he has a chance. I'll say that. Part of me though is just like, it's just so hard to win when your quarterback makes that much money and he's not a Mahomes tier player. I think about this, and again, I'm not trying to bring the Chiefs up, but like, Mahomes is the best quarterback in the whole league. Andy Reid's a top, 2 or 3 coach in football. Brett Veach hit on 8 draft picks this year. They had the 1 seed in their conference, and they won the Super Bowl by 3 points and maybe got lucky to do so. That is how hard it is to win the Super Bowl when your quarterback is on veteran money. And I think about like how many other things need to go right for the Giants to have similar glory when Daniel Jones is making about what Mahomes is making. That to me is like the gamble that I'm just so wary about, because it's just this is a franchise, your guy Bill won 2 Super Bowls there. Like, this is a franchise that's not they're happy about this year, but a couple years from now they're going to want another ring. And is Daniel Jones the guy that can win a ring for you? I think there's a chance. I don't know if it's a great chance.
Great dialogue. Thank you.
I know this has been a lot of fun. We're already an hour and 8 minutes in, so we're probably going to wrap up here. But I do want to thank every one of you for coming here. Alex, Jameson, Mojal, Doug Analytics, everybody that asked questions. We really appreciate you. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Sumer Sports. We have what is going to be a pretty exciting new part to sumersports.com next week. So stay tuned to our website. We're really excited for that. Again, do us all a favor, pass this podcast along to one of your friends, to one of your relatives. Again, help us grow the show. We plan on this offseason being an amazing one here at the Sumer Sports Show and at sumersports.com specifically. And again, we really appreciate you coming and spending your Wednesday evening with us. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 32 of the Sumer Sports Show.